We believe in opening government that suffering is never an aesthetic and not something that should be fetishized in order to gain utilitarian goals and benefits. What glorification uniquely does, specifically in this motion, is two things. The first one is that it simplifies suffering in a way that the kinds of suffering that we experience as individuals, like traumas, violence, and abuses, is something that's simplified and codified in a one idea of what suffering looks like. The second thing that it does is that glorification commodifies suffering in a way that it becomes a standard to make good art, especially when glorification means that this is something that's appreciated, this is something that's demanded by audiences and people. What is our goal in opening government? We're not saying that suffering is illegitimate or something that's completely unnatural. We would rather say that what glorification specifically does is the glorification is what we specifically regret in this motion. So in terms of like counterfactual of absence the glorification of suffering in art, we believe that suffering can still exist in some portrayals of art, but rather when you say that something is glorified, that's what we specifically regret. So what does glorification look like now in our specifically what we're debating with? So what glorification looks like is when people demand, when audiences seek this kind of content in order to like consume the kinds of films, the kinds of literature and books that they want to purchase, which means that when glorification, what glorification does is that it also puts artists on a pedestal to do specifically this kind of art alone because this is something that's demanded by people. Because obviously the first important characterization that we have to point out in the debate is that art is something that's been used as a living by artists, which means that artists for so long have demanded themselves to be gain like compensation whenever they create art. So we think that this is important to clarify because of when you talk about glorification, it puts artists on a pedestal to specifically gain money because of it. So what is our trade-off specifically in opening government? What we would rather say is that even if in opposition bench, if they say that we need more discussion on suffering in terms of like art because it enables people to like recognize certain forms of suffering, we want to ask them and they need to prove specifically why on art as a medium that is used as a vehicle to portray those forms of suffering when in fact there are other better means to portray and actually talk about art and not talk about suffering and not specifically just about art. So there are two discussions then. The first one is that the arbitrariness of art makes it harder to understand these sufferings. So basically, when we talk about art, this is something that's subjective to the consumers, which means that this is true because there are different motivations for people to understand art. Two things. So number one, like because they are basing their interpretation of art on their different and various experiences. Like for example, if I'm coming from a poor background, then likely I would have a different interpretation of art as opposed to someone who came from a rich family or whatnot. But also there are other cultural capitals like economic that affects my interpretation of art. What does this mean? It means that when we talk about glorification, what it does is that it makes suffering an object or like a notion of subjectivity which people can interpret depending on their own understanding of it. We think that this is incredibly bad because when you talk about suffering, when you talk about violence, when you talk about like domestic abuses in family, we think that these are something that should never be subjective to the eyes of viewers. Specifically, when you talk about glorification, it puts viewers on a pedestal that this is something that's if this is something that how if this is how I understand art or suffering to be in this specific art, then likely it will affect what will be my future or interpretations or perspective of what suffering will look like. We think that this is so bad because for a majority of people, and especially for people who haven't like experienced such forms of suffering like trauma or like violences, we think that this is something that they cannot predict overall in their future. And when you talk about glorification of art, when they see and when they view these kinds of portrayal, we think that it it makes them not understand the current situation that they're currently in because of the fact that the art that they watched previously before is something that affected and like projected what will be their perspective of art. So moving on to my second case about how it affects consumers. So what is the argument here? We think that specifically glorification dilutes the suffering to mere something that people consume and people something that can commodify. So when we talk about art, specifically, this is something that we appreciate whenever we see art, whenever we go to the museum. And this is something that usually we don't want to talk about, because when we consume art, we do it as a form of escapism, we do it as a form of experience or whatnot. So we think that opposition here needs to prove the causality, to change systems and to change the way the way people suffer because of merely the glorification of art specifically. What we would rather say in opening government is that we believe that the glorification has left other forms of suffering in the margin, because of the fact that when you talk about glorification, like this means that there's also a rise of content and saturation of this portrayal in media. Like for example, um, like if you talk about Netflix, whenever you watch Netflix, like the kind of content that
On
you're
that point, sir.
gonna be the kind of content that you're gonna be projected in is something that should be about suffering or whatnot over the eyes of the consumers. So we think that this has made utilitarian usage of suffering to earn money. But before that, yeah,
Do you
POI.
think art is a one-way street?
Um, like art should never be a one-way street, but specifically when you talk about glorification, it makes suffering a one-way street for people to understand it. So going back to what the glorification means in order for the consumers and for the people who watch it, it means that you're suffering whenever you experience a trauma, and this is something that's used for a content in media or in films or in art. We think that this is used as a utilitarian tool in order to gain money. Because we think that, since going back to the characterization earlier about artists, about earning money in order to produce more art, the primary aim of art is to earn, and in order for these people to actually be able to sustain themselves. Why is this incredibly bad? Because we think that for majority of individuals who experience suffering, it commodifies what they feel like, and it's something that, aestheticized by individuals and not something that we can really talk about. So if really what we want to do is talk about these instances of abuses, and art shall never be the vehicle for that. And we think that the glorification has made it harder for people to understand what suffering really looks like. In conclusion, we believe that suffering shall never be subjective, and that the glorification has incredibly made it more harmful for victims.
We think the reason why opposition government loses this debate is because they never tell us in conclusive detail as to why commodification is necessarily bad. We think if we are living in a capitalist society and where capitalism has commodified everything, including the most important of social justice movements like feminism, etc., and we think the opportunity cost of that is that more awareness and even if these ideologies are sold to people as commodities, we don't think that it's a harm, because at the end of the day, in the very best scenario, it awares people about the different conditions and different lived experiences of people, right? We don't think that if commodification makes people more aware about and generates a social critique, we don't understand why commodification is necessarily bad, right? And even glorification, for that matter, isn't necessarily bad, as long as it has historically created a narrative again with people who suffer, right? The first thing that they tell us is that glorification homogenizes trauma, and it makes it a one-way street, and there is no other interpretation of suffering that can go through or float during the transmission, right? We think that the fundamental response to that is that the problem is that because of the fact that you have already considered that artists are given pedestal when they create the art which glorifies trauma, we think in that particular, we think if artists are given pedestal for creating art that glorifies trauma, that means that essentially means there's a large competition within that market, right? And if you need to outdo the other person, other competitor within that competition, you need to create and present a different perspective on trauma, different perspective about suffering of these people's lives, which means that you have large interpretations, large perspectives, amount of perspectives on the suffering of these people, right? Which means that their entire argument about how it homogenizes trauma and makes it one-way street and makes it a singular monocular interpretation simply goes away, because there is enough competition within that market to create and to talk about the most uniquest perspective about suffering to begin with, right? But say that we don't think that art should be a medium of critique and social critique, etc. We disagree. We think large majority of audiences are not educated enough, or they aren't nuanced enough to understand suffering through, articles or books or newspapers, etc., or other mediums. We think art is a very relatable medium, and we think that because of the fact that people go to it excessively. For example, these are things like songs, these are things like movies, etc., which people go for an escapist purpose. We think if these things are used for social critique, we think they're much more effective, and that is why we want art to, glorify suffering, because it generates a narrative, because art in and of itself is an accessible medium as opposed to other mediums of social critique, like media, etc., right? But secondly, we think, thirdly, they say that, there is, it makes it subjective, or interpretation of it becomes subjective. We don't think that is exclusive on our side, because even if you socially critique suffering from other scenarios, we think they can be as much subjective, as much as victims of subjectivity, to begin with, right? We think other mediums are as much as prone to subjectivity and misinterpretation as this is, right? But secondly, we don't think that this is always the case, because assuming that there's an art piece, then the artist also has agency over the kind of interpretation that is going to happen in the society, right? So it can tell the viewer that this is the kind of interpretation that you should be taking out. I think that there is absolutely no problem of interpretation, because of the fact that we're living in a capitalist market, and we think we don't think commodification is a problem to begin with, right? Why do we not regret commodification, glorification of suffering in art? We think there are three reasons for that. Number one, we think because of the fact that who are these sufferers to begin with, right? These are people who have faced sexual assault, people who are differently abled, and who have, faced different kind of marginalization and discrimination in the society to begin with, right? Because of the fact that they do not get enough representation in other scenarios, in other cases, in other avenues, like for example pop culture or media, or even in their institutes or in other scenarios, right? We think these people feel left out, and when they see their own stories being glorified, their own individual lives being glorified and being seen in the light, that this is something that is desirable, this is something, you know this is what suffering is, this is how what a brave person is. I think these people are able to have an emotional reaction to it. They have a visceral cathartic response to it. I think it humanizes these people as individuals, right? So if glorification, first of all, the fundamental advantage of that is that it creates catharsis within the people who have actually gone through suffering to begin with, right? We think it makes them feel more human, and we think that that's a potential advantage of this glorification, right? But secondly, we think the more you can create a narrative in the society about respecting these people, about venerating their trauma and venerating their daily struggles through art as well. So for example, when these people are shown that they're struggling every day, and then they have to go through struggle every day, and they're living through it, and they are the real heroes in the society, that means that when your impressionable audiences, your young teens, etc., are watching, then they are likely to respect these people to begin with in their own real lives, right? We think that kind of a trickle down effect on people, how they're able to create marginally more space for these people, more respect for these people, it makes society a better place. We think that's a potential advantage of this glorification of suffering. We think we shouldn't let go of that to begin with, right? But thirdly, what happens in a counterfactual, right? You cannot dismiss the idea that historically people with disabilities and people with sexual assault and all the trauma have been gaslit within the traditional media as well, because of the fact that there wasn't social awareness previously, right? So for example, in cartoons, etc., people with disabilities were often shown as villains, as people filled with rage and people filled with vengeance, etc. And also, victims of sexual assault were displayed as someone who, as they have been, they have invited that on themselves, or they are attention seekers or something like that. In the absence of this one, we think in the absence of glorification of suffering within the art, you will have these art forms which vilify and which villainize people who have suffered, people with disabilities, etc. With that particular suffering creates counter narrative and creates minimum space for the propagation of such narratives to begin with. What have we shown to you today in this house? Number one, glorification of this particular suffering creates an emotional response and a cathartic response within the victims, and we think that their catharsis is very important in this house. But secondly, glorification makes it so that you can able to create a narrative within the society that you have to respect these people, and that trickle down creates more space for these people. And thirdly, that curbs the space for narratives of vilification, which display people with disabilities in a vilification, light of vilification glorification, right? We think we're living in a capitalist world. Commodification and glorification are the only way in which we are able to, create a general narrative within the public. We are very, very proud and we do not regret it at all.
I have 2 points of responses before I go on to my substantive material. Firstly, let's talk about their whole competition argument. They claim that it's good for this to become glorified because we create a competition in the market. Therefore, there are a lot of narratives that emerges about these suffering experiences. Therefore, there's a net benefit. There are 2 responses to this. Firstly, notice how they rebutted their case inherently. Abuse, colonization, poverty should not be simplified and be generalized as a means for me creating art in of itself. We think that the unique experiences that these individuals have is something that we ought to respect and they ought to have dignity over. You saying that these things should be a commodity, that at least we have other narratives that overlay one another, in of itself is inherent harm, which is the second thing. You fight over which trauma, you fight over which suffering or experiences is better over the other. This in itself is an inherent attack or inherent invalidation of certain sufferings. That your suffering is not good enough to be heard in the public. That your suffering is something that we ought to not care about. These are the harms that the capitalist society that they claim under their side with their own metric is something that's inherently harmful, right? So we think that the fact that it overrides one another is something that we ought to regret through the means of glorification and channeling people opting into this. The second thing that they claim, we create social awareness, therefore that is good. Notice that under our side, at no point did we say that suffering should not exist completely. We claim that there are net harms that exist through glorification. That means more people opting in, more people simplifying the art, and more people just commodifying these certain things and reducing the value that people who suffer or people experience these certain things, right? So under our side, all the benefits occur. The unique thing that they were never able to prove is why glorification leads to unique benefits like these certain aspects. We think that those things can be comfortable under our side. What's my substantive material? Firstly, I'm going to talk about the suffering artist. The secondly, I'm going to talk about the lies of resilience that art provides in terms of suffering. Let's talk about the first one. The context I want to build here, that inherently suffering is something that's relatable to a lot of people. Therefore, there's a glorification towards suffering in and of itself. There are 2 things to note here. Firstly, it is simple to relate to, but secondly, individuals can write about suffering easier compared to happy experience that they have. Therefore, there's an abundance of suffering. That's why there's a lot of sad songs, a lot of sad art that currently exists when it's sad. There are two layers to this that there are 2 layers of analysis that I want to talk about here. Firstly, that the suffering of an artist is reduced to a mere aesthetic, right? This is an expounded idea that my prime minister talked about. Firstly, the way art is inherently in status quo, art is not sellable. That a lot of people don't sell or don't buy happy art. People don't buy art that is just generally in a positive note, right? A lot of people are more inclined to opt into sad art or arts that portray suffering because this is something that is sellable to them, because this is relatable to them. What does this mean? It means that a lot of people want stories behind these certain arts that are good for them. Therefore, a lot of artists feel like they need to suffer first in order to create good art, because their definition of good art is the amount of people who consume it. That's the reason why glorification is harmful, because people then force themselves to experience bad things for themselves. This is when people try to experience bad relationships or try to internalize or say that these are experiences that I have that are inherently harmful and try to channel it in modes of artwork, right? And through the mediums of artwork. This is the examples of broken relationships and what have you, right? The glorification forces you into these decisions which you otherwise wouldn't have opted into because of the existence of this glamorification, right? The alternative that we wanted to have is like at least the abolishment of this and allowing other alternatives to emerge in the end of the day, right? We think that that's something that's net harmful because you coerce artists into opting in this model simply because it's something that is sellable. But the second thing to note here is suffering is a human experience, but art shouldn't be a glorifying channel. Notice, trauma and suffering shouldn't always have a meaning to it, right? That's something that we're gonna claim on coming from opening government. Glorification pressures that this is a channel and it's the only ways to mean it. That all the trauma that you have, all the experience that you have has a meaning, and the only way you could find meaning to it is by channeling it through art. We think that that's something that is harmful, and that's what glorification has resulted into, that people find meaning from their suffering, that people find meaning to these certain things, right? At best, we just say that these probably most traumas that people have doesn't have a value added meaning to it, and rather we'd prefer that they would go to therapy or what have you. But people just dilute and say this is the medium that we want to opt it into. But the discussion goes away from suffering as well under our side, under their side of the house. Because in most instances, when people see suffering artists or suffering artworks, they talk about the aesthetics of it, not about the lived experience of the individuals underpinning it. That's the reason why Van Gogh's artwork is just aesthetically pleasing, but nobody talks about the lived experience. That's why a lot of artists or musical artists also or only talked about the beauty or the aesthetic that their music was able to provide, but not the artist was suffering underpinning it, right? Because people think that if you are sad, you create better art in the end of the day. We think that these are conflicting things. Then they claim, we at least create a narrative of suffering, therefore there's a net benefit. We concede, but the reasons that we provide the suffering shouldn't be a commodity in of itself. But the harm here is that the suffering becomes the prerequisite to make good art. The very instance that it becomes a prerequisite in of itself is something that we ought to regret. Before I go on to a second case closing.
Right. Why do you think historically people have spent centuries buying beautiful paintings of flower vases in your world?
Fly, what? Could you repeat the last part?
Just why do you think people buy paintings of things like flower vases or beautiful scenery in your world and engage with that?
People buy aesthetic things because it's aesthetically pleasing. The debate focuses on an existing status quo where there's a glorification of suffering because people think that suffering is something that's relatable to them and people want to find value or find meaning in suffering. Because people are forced to find meaning in suffering and they opt into these certain artworks, it leads to them just like commodifying or taking these things as a commodity and not trying to look for actual help that allows them to channel that in a better outcome. We think that that's the harm that they're not engaging with. The second thing I want to talk about is the lies of resilience, right? We think that art will have a story. So there are three things under this claim. Firstly, people who will make the art isn't always from the community or the people who were part of that suffering, right? We think that that is real in status quo. When a lot of people make artworks about the poor, people make artworks about poverty, about victims of catastrophes or what have you, right? So we think that there's an underrepresentation here. But even if there is representation, the discussion isn't about the trauma, but it's about the aesthetics, like precisely what I told you earlier. But lastly, and crucially, art cannot tell the entire story of these certain things, right? Stories of abuse, stories of stories of bad relationship with these certain things. These cannot be simply told in just a song or things in certain artworks, right? This is the reason why my first speaker is important. Because when he said that there's a vagueness in art, means that there's no way, there's a diversity of people who interpret these certain artworks and doesn't allow an actual representation of these individual people, right? Or what their experiences are. People are forced to see this as an aesthetic value rather than internalized meaning of these certain things. It dilutes the actual meaning that these artworks hold, and we think that that's harmful for people who actually experiences these harms because it does not represent them. It doesn't talk about what these people really experience. We think that glorification is harmful because you force people into thinking that this is the only way to make good, yet you need to suffer first in order to make good art, and commodifying overrides things. Therefore, there's a competition, these are things. We're very proud of those.
Three. Notice, panel, that the main issue that side opening government has is not with the fact that suffering has been glorified within the artworks of artists, but rather how capitalism has utilized this suffering or how capitalism is structuring one art over the other. We don't think that the inherent regret that you would have over the glorification of art really fits here in the context of the argumentations that they've brought about. Specifically when they talk to you about how, because there's an inherent sense of dignity that should always be associated with those who are suffering, that our entire notion about capitalism being wrong and not the glorification of suffering within art would necessarily mean that one suffering will be over the other. This is a problem of capitalism that might see that more people have generally similar sorts of suffering and thus would much more relate to a certain type, not particularly the glorification of that suffering in and of itself. So that bifurcation is absolutely important for the panel to understand in order to weigh this debate in and of itself, right? But secondly, they talk to you about how, the entire notion about why individuals opt into buying art from these artists, or why suffering artists exist in the first place, is because this content is relatable, it's easier, it's aesthetic, and all of those nice things, right? The real question then is, okay, even if in a world where this art, this glorification of this suffered art is seen as something that's regrettable, will people less likely associate with it? Will they find it less easier to buy into it or opt into it? We don't think that that's true. People will still find this just as relatable, just as something that they want to associate with, and all of those things. So we think that their entire argumentation about this is trivial at best, and we don't think that it really counteracts that in and of itself. But secondly, we think that this is very important, and that is the fact that most people don't buy into the aesthetics of suffering and things of that sort, the sort of argumentation that opening government was trying to make. Why is this so? We think that most people want feel good art, they want feel good media. This is why Bollywood mega bombastic movies that release on Eid get millions and billions of viewers, and the aesthetic movies that for example, Irfan Khan would make would get very few viewerships, or would be relegated to the side, especially those relating to suffering and things of that sort. Why is this so? Because people find it much easier to escape into such realities where there is nothing wrong that's happening and that the hero is always winning. Those sorts of art that are actively portraying and showcasing and highlighting suffering really don't get the same sort of traction. So their entire argumentation about how capitalism is causing, the oversaturation of this art and all of those things simply does not stand. But even in the worst case scenario, we tell you that the fact that you would then stop these individuals, these artists, from expressing themselves through the channel of their art to express the real sort of visceral emotions that they felt through their suffering is something that's wrong and morally abhorrent, especially when the thing that you regret is how capitalism utilizes their art rather than the art in and of itself, which is why we think that that is necessarily problematic, right? But then let's come on to the sorts of argumentations that they made about art being suffering being subjective because of art being abstract, things of those sorts. There are three responses to this. Number one, the response is that there is always a certain portrayal that the artist is trying to make. This is something that Shah Jahan also talked to you about how the artist has a certain intention when they're making an art, and that's always relative to the art that they're creating, and people can always associate with that sort of portrayal. But secondly, we think that good art generally just evokes a sense of emotion. So if the emotion of me understanding what that suffering that individual, that trauma that individual might be going through is something that I can just emotionally feel, then it's not subjective, and I understand from the perspective of that individual what's happening. But thirdly, even if suffering becomes subjective because of the abstraction that art exists and because of the sort of place that I come from, we think that the advantage of the personal connection that you can make based on your lived experience and the connection with the emotionality you feel with that art specifically makes it something that's important to relate with, and thus actively try to create a narrative that benefits overall the society. We think that that's a net benefit on our side. But secondly, this entire notion about the saturation, we've already talked to you about how it's not mainstream at all to want suffering art. It's usually feel good art that goes about this and wants. But even if people just watch a lot of content that is based on this sort of suffering, we think that this increases the sense of discourse within society and how much people are talking about mental traumas and health and things of that sort. So even if movies like The Joker come out, the fact that a lot of people then start conversing about mental health, about the societal pressures that economics and capitalism has brought about on the individual, we think that all of those are a net benefit to have. And the reason why you would regret something is whether or not it's creating a better narrative or whether or not people are becoming more aware. And we think that both of those things are going to be fulfilled within our side of the model, which is why we think that you wouldn't regret these at all in the first place. Is there any POI from closing?
OG?
OG?
Okay. Your benefits assume a creation of good art that justifiably portrays suffering. For the vast majority of artworks, like 13 Reasons Why, Van Gogh, they have portrayed suffering as something necessary to be legitimate and sellable. Why is that good on your side?
Why is that not good? That's the real question. Because if people can relate to the sort of trauma that individuals went through in 13 Reasons Why or Van Gogh's painting, then that actively creates narratives or at least discussions about those things. We think that's a net benefit on our side, irrespective of what you're trying to argue. But what's my positive extension here? We understand that suffering for a lot of people means no escape, and this is something that's highly important. Because people think that if they are suffering, then there isn't a way out for them. For a lot of artists, then art becomes that sort of avenue where which they can express themselves. But even for people that are simply consuming art, there are three ways in which this escapism helps them. Number one, it allows them to identify ways in which they can deal with this sort of art. Secondly, it shows to them how the world might see the things that they're going through and how they can work out in terms of how the world sees them in relative to what they themselves are feeling or believing and things of that sort. But thirdly, we think that the glorification aspect specifically shows to them that there's nothing to be ashamed of for what they are going through. All three of these mean that in a net positive for those individuals who feel like there's no escape from their suffering. They find some form of relief in all of these things. Four things that we've told you here: catharsis for the artist and the viewer. Secondly, awareness of the suffering. Thirdly, humanization of the victims and people with disabilities. And fourthly, the way out and the escapism that it provides is highly important. So proud to oppose.
So what side closing government is going to be doing is we will bring to you two extensions for our case, and we will integrate our rebuttals into the extensions and show to you why this debate has not really encompassed what glorification looks like in the real world and what what mechanisms come into place with how glorification happens and how it is something to be regretted. So now the first extension that we're going to be bringing into the debate and how it directly clashes with O and what they wanted to talk about. So O had this whole idea about how this leads to catharsis for victims of different type of suffering, and it leads to humanization, and it also leads to recognition and a way of escapism for people, because they see ways to identify what they're going through, then they see ways of how world will see it, and there is nothing to be ashamed of what they're going through. But what we are going to tell you is how there is a misrepresentation of this suffering in general art, how there is a lot of misrepresentation of what these people are going through generally specifically when it comes to mental health issues. There is a wide range of misrepresentation that happens, which shows like 13 reasons why there is gross misrepresentation of how people go through mental health issues and how mental health issues are being represented in general. Because when we see shows like 13 reasons why, the way that they show people who are depressed is not something that is generally true with how the disease clinically goes about. And then generally the idea about how the character that is shown to be depressed or going through mental health issues is the protagonist, and then we believe that is not something that is a lived experience, right? Because people who are going through mental health issues are generally in the shadows, people that have a lot of anonymity and loneliness that they're going through, and we believe that is not something that is represented in the shows that they show, and we believe that is misrepresentation that leads to much more harm, and that glorification leads to much more harm, because that is not relatable to the people who are going through that suffering. And we believe that idea of not relating directly rebuts the idea that both speakers of opening opposition were for people to actually understand of how suffering works and how suffering for these people is going to come about. But we believe that it does not come about because the misrepresentation leads to more issues, because we believe when this misrepresentation comes about, how it really
You left.
side closing government was telling you how misrepresentation is what leads to these issues not really getting the kind of discourse that the discourse is created with glorification, but the discourse that is created is of mental health issues being cool and hip. And we believe that is not something that is the discourse that is A, healthy, and B, something that is real for people who have clinically diagnosed mental health conditions. And we believe that is something problematic when it comes to art being created and art being represented in the media, because then what it does is it leads to this atmosphere where people are self-diagnosing themselves to be depressed or have going through mental health issues like anxiety. And we believe that is something that leads to more and more misinformation and echo chambers being created in general, and that is not that leads to mental health issues being made into something that they're not. And we believe when that comes about, it clearly removes all the harms, all the benefits that opening opposition tried to bring in, with the world trying to see the issues as human and the issues being portrayed as human. We believe that goes away with when you have this misrepresentation happening all over the media. And then the second part that we like to bring about to you is how the mechanism of actually suffering impacts artists as a stakeholder. We believe that opening government did not analyze artists as a stakeholder completely. So what we believe is when artists when artists that are making art are impacted by all the art that shows suffering, and the art that shows suffering is something that is more appreciated. We believe why that happens, the mechanism that they think that art that has pain is only appreciated is because of the literature that surrounds art, right? We believe critics generally prefer art that has a more element of suffering into it. And we believe what that does is the glorification coming from critics and people who have more grasp of what nuances with art, what nuances are attached to art. We believe what that does is that creates this unnecessary pressure on artists to actually have more suffering in their life. And we believe that leads to artists being stuck in this quagmire where they believe that the happy art that they're making, or the art that comes from a happy place, is not something that would get the critical acclaim that art that has been made from places of suffering, or places where they are they have suffered a lot in their life would make. And we believe this creates this a narrative where the artist is harmed, because we believe when artists that are really going through issues make art, and that art is put on a pedestal, we believe it really neglects the art that is being made by artists that are not going through the same lived experiences. And we believe then when artists are forced to make art with experiences that are not lived, we believe that is not art that is that people can relate to, and that is not art that is true to them. And we believe that people should not be forced into making art that anyone cannot relate to. That's why we believe that glorification of art is something that has harmed the artists and art and consumers in general. Now I'll take a POF from opening.
Sir, we have already told you that the art glorifying the suffering is already in minority because feel-good movies like Bollywood are sold majorly, right? But even in your particular best-case scenario, we think that the kind of art that vilifies people with disabilities, like cartoons representing people with disabilities as villains, etc., are effectively curbed when there is glorification of suffering of people. Why is that not a good advantage in your word?
Okay.
In our word.
Side closing government does not really believe that the vilification of people. We believe representation should exist. Representation of handicapped people and people who are going through mental health issue of suffering is something that is important. But we do not believe that that vilification of people with these issues exists to the level that side opening opposition is trying to portray. And B, even if that vilification exists, we do not believe that glorification really takes that vilification away, because we believe that the misrepresentation that happens, the form of art and the level and the culture that the art is being made into is what leads to these issues being presented in a good way. We still have Bollywood movies presenting people with disabilities as something to be laughed about, and we believe that would still exist, because we do not believe that is about cultural sensitivity. And we believe art being made anywhere and the cultural nuances attached with it would still lead to that art being made. And we do not believe the vilification still exists with progress being made into how things are seen in the world. And that's why we hope you vote for side closing government. Thank you.
The question that all of GovBench fails to answer in this debate is that in the absence of this glorification of suffering, why would the world have ever moved away from dominant aesthetic norms, such as pictures of flower vases or the kind of Bollywood movies that CG talks to you about, which only show rich boys who vacation in Switzerland, as the dominant form of representation? We think then that the first clarification we are sad to issue in this debate as late as CO is that this debate at every point has to be a retrospective and has to operate in terms of what the world looks like in terms of art now. We think the world that we're talking about looks like a world where movies like Parasite are now being nominated and winning Oscars, where OTT platforms such as Instagram, where people can boost their art through community presence, is making these forms of art more and more mainstream in terms of independent content creators, and where someone like Banksy, who makes disruptive protest street art, is also being recognized as a part of canonical art traditions only because there exists a market for suffering. And we think that we're ready to defend the hard burden of suffering as a commodity and how it's exclusive to this kind of glorification in a way that our opening does not. We think at best our opening tells you that there are some reasons why there should probably be the existence of certain kinds of minority art, and they should have a right to maybe portray their suffering. We think they do this somewhat reductively, and here's how we're going to extend from that. We think they give you no structural reasons, firstly, why privileged people will care and part with their privilege or the material manifestations of their privilege to actually emancipate sufferers in any way, or why this conversation will ever be focused on any kind of emancipation or justice in the first place. To the extent that they tell you that there'll probably be spaces of catharsis and relief associated with this minority's expression of their art, we think that's the only thing OO is able to reasonably tell you, that maybe there exists an avenue within this art where they can do so. I'm going to be talking to you about 4 things, and then I'm going to move on to the worst case scenario in this debate that'll take out all of GovBench before, if I have time, moving on to some specific rebuttals to either Gov side, right? The first is, we think on CO that even though Titanic did an awful job of showing how poverty really works, it at least acknowledged that a lower deck existed with non-gentrified classes. We think many years later, when Parasite wins an Oscar for its portrayal of poverty outside the first world, the comparative in this debate looks like how the glorification of suffering has led to suffering being recognized recognized as more and more legitimate in spaces of art and something that needs to be portrayed in its visceral truth. So our first extension from CO is going to be that the erasure of minority narratives from art as a space itself is what you cause the second you think that suffering is not something that should be validly a part of art. What do I mean? The very idea that art should be focused on beautiful things or happy experiences is minority exclusionary. Every day we think minority, and those of them who make art also, of course, subsumed within that, inextricably face the politics of their suffering in terms of material deprivation, in terms of not having resources or access to education to go to fancy art academies, or having access to spaces where white juries will dismiss their work because they're women or persons of color. We think these are things people face in the everyday, which means that their real lives are not removed from this suffering. We think the first burden on Gov in this debate then is to show how this blocking out of suffering altogether does not deprive these communities of the very basic prerogative to even represent their lives in art. And conversely, how art itself then remains a privileged space on GovBench's side because there is no disruption, there is no space for minorities to even talk about the truths that they live every day. On this side, on this bench, we're happy to defend the truth of an art that is like political. We think art should be political because the lives of these people are political, and not allowing them to represent it as such, not allowing them to profit off of their suffering, and forget profit, but even represent it, is the kind of violent exclusion that has historically been faced in the absence of this glorification. We think on that front alone, there is a principled obligation to allow these minorities to denote their lives, to allow them to make art a political space where they can assert these identities in the first place. And there is absolutely no justification for not allowing them to do that. But we think, secondly, that the effective or moral logic of art makes it a different space from a purely economic commodity sort of market. We think art is governed by its own morality of what is considered beautiful in a way that OG tries to argue to you, but does a very poor job of, because we don't think they ground this in terms of how these standards of beauty actually manifest, in terms of the creation of high culture art that hangs in galleries and museums and is painted by white men and doesn't really have meaning in itself. We don't think that art exists without meaning. We think it's the erasure of these political functions of art that has historically happened, and the fact that these content creators, in the absence of this glorification, were largely these privileged cis white men who dominated these gallery spaces, that has led to you thinking that beauty in itself is something apolitical. We think again at every point that it erases the narratives of these minorities, like I said before, but it also sets standards within art that mean that this is the kind of art that is likely to be considered pricey art and valuable art. We think we're reaching a point slowly through the kind of glorification that exists on our side where this is changing, through examples like Banksy and stuff that I tell you about. And we see no reason to disrupt this course to a world where more and more kinds of art are mainstream, and hence their sale value equals or begins to equal that of these white men who hang in galleries and serve no political purpose but to propagate their own privilege. But lastly, in terms of the changing landscape of art with glorification, and here's where I'll get into impacting this debate in three ways. We think this means that there is a creation of a market for minority art. In the best case scenario, we think this looks like a democratization of art and the removal of barriers for minority artists to enter the market at all. We think this is not going to happen in the absence of this, because no one on site Gov has given you a reason to believe that market incentives change at all. So art presumably on all of GovBench still looks like a space that is dominated by white narratives. They've not told you why art will be discarded as a space that indulges the privileged and the bourgeoisie and allows them to assert their identities. So they've not told you why art is going to become unimportant in their world either. We think then art exists as a barrier and as a war space of privileged dominance that repeats in a cycle where it excludes these minorities on their side. But on the other hand, we think that even in terms of, and I'm going to come down to this worst case scenario sort of analysis now in terms of my impacting and show you how on our side, even if this art is not in fact democratic in palatable in all ways and representative of suffering, we think that misrepresentation still exists as something that is better than violent erasure. We think the suffering of artists around the world exists not only in terms of their minority status, but also in terms of the double jeopardy of their minority suffering not being considered beautiful historically, being considered ugly, being concealed. We think this is consistent with things like slum demolition in big cities. We think this is about literally erasing the problems of those that people don't want to engage with. In the worst case scenario, where there's literally misrepresentation, we think that's still better than this violent erasure because of three reasons. I'm going to wrap this up real quick. We think the mainstreaming of this, we create an impetus on privileged artists to engage with suffering at all. We think we force artists to get out of their echo chambers of white academies and at least engage with the lives of those who exist outside. These are the artists who historically have capital, and we think it's important to weaponize that privilege guilt against them. But even in a world where this leads to the production of absolutely terrible trauma porn as a dominant norm, we think there is a unique capacity that visceral images have to tap into the savior complex of privileged individuals. We think this disrupts people's sense of the world and of their own material privilege in terms of things like the Vietnam War being aired on TV and managing to change the entirety of the US's political will. We think this disruption needs to be visceral and hence needs to exist at the scale of glorification, not just in terms of niche indie corners where minority art can propagate. And this happens exclusively through this glorification. We're very, very proud to oppose.
There we go. So, ladies and gentlemen, as the whip speaker of closing government, first of all, I would like to present a few clashes over here, which I believe the entire debate evolved around. So, the first clash was which kind of art is liked more, happy kind of art or sad kind of art, kind of art which presents sunshine and flowers, or the kind of art which represents suffering and bloodshed, etc. Well, let me tell you that this is not what even the entire debate was about, and the team opposition somehow made their own responsibility to explain how happy art is what is more sold off in Bollywood movies, etc., 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 etc. This was never our line of engagement, but it's still over the fact that when closing government came and specifically talked about how glorification means admiring something more over another thing, which is the entire debate is about comparing two kinds of art and glorifying one over another. When you say that you are favoring a kind of art over another is what we are opposing, right? So basically what happens is that a little bit of explanation to this clash is that when more emotions, when a deeply attracting story is attached to something is what attracts viewers, and that is the kind of art we call the sellable art, and the kind of art that people generally are more interested in. Now this is very understandable in its own, that when suffering, when someone who's being done wrong, when a heartbreak, when tears, when death is involved into something, it has a lot more emotions than a person who's happy. For example, just because his dog is not sick anymore is involved, right? Now it could mean everything to the owner of the dog, but it is so much more hard to make the viewers understand a small happiness than it is to make the viewers understand about a small distress. This is why we said that glorifying of art, glorifying of suffering in art spreads out very quickly than that of the happy kind of art. And this is what we are opposing. Now the second main clash in this debate was, is suffering represented the right way in art? Now there are two answers to that. It could be represented the right way, it could be represented the wrong way, but it is mostly represented the wrong way. Why? Because everyone deals with their issues differently. The first speaker of closing government talked about it, and a little bit from the opening government also talked about it, that everybody deals with situations differently. If an artist decides to interpret a kind of situation which involves struggling or mental health issues, for example some show or some painting, etc., and a person who deals with it in manner A, and a person who deals with it in manner B, let's say, is in minority, and the other kind of people are in majority, is the difference we are creating. For example, people start to self-diagnosing themselves. People start to look upon a certain kind of solution which an artist has presented to deal with the kind of situation, because we are glorifying it actively, right? Basic when being opposition comes and they talk about how erasure of struggle from art is very inhumane, and it should not happen. We never promoted a violent erasure of struggle from art in the first place. What we are talking about is not to actively glorify it over other kind of art, because as closing government, we also told you that how artists are very badly affected by it. For example, this is not new to us to know that so many singers are often told to maybe just come after a heartbreak to sing a song, because they don't have deeper voices, because their heart doesn't ache enough, because the lyrics are not strong enough, and all these mainstream secret lines which are thrown over young artists and artists who want to thrive, just because they haven't suffered to that level of they haven't basically lived through that level of suffering as other artists have, and yet they are looked down upon. They're pressed down, right? This is what we oppose. This is what, as closing government, we have been opposing, because and also a very main clash in this entire debate was about opposition, especially closing opposition, believe that glorification of suffering means acknowledgement of suffering. No, that is not true at all. See, acknowledgement of suffering in art is amazing, and we never oppose that. But acknowledgement of suffering does not require the glorification of that kind of art in particular. We do not want we do not want to be promoting the dominance of one kind of art is what we are talking about, because then the other kind of art, the other kind of artists and the other kind of people, they are being forced to basically, if a person does not relate with the sad kind of art, and a person does relate to them, and then this is the kind of difference we are creating in the audience, right? People are forced to believe in a certain kind of interpretation of an art is what we are opposing. So when you talk about how violent erasure of suffering in art is bad, etc., and it leaves no place for minorities to speak up, ma'am, we completely agree with you, and we never talked about violent erasure of art in the first place. So as team closing government, we gave you the extensions about how misrepresentation of suffering of art in general is leads to the kind of disclosure of these issues, which discourse of these issues, which we do not want, because it's not healthy, because not everybody knows how to deal with mental health issues. Not every artist knows how to deal with mental health issues, but only for the sake of only for the sake of announcing it more and more in the media, and announcing it more and more for their own fame, that they're so attached with the audience that they want to talk about their issues, although they just don't know how to talk about that particular issue in the first place, is what we are against, right? And yeah, so yes, and another thing is about when team opening government came and talked about how it leads to people dividing the kind of suffering they dividing their kind of suffering. For example, like a smaller suffering and a bigger suffering kind of terms are used. Well, this is something which opening government did not exactly explain, but closing government did that. When basically what happens is that when suffering is glorified, there is a desire in the audience for knowing about a deeper rooted story, for knowing more and more, for knowing something more sadder, for knowing something which involves more tears, which involves much bigger of a heartbreak, which then leads to lack of sympathy and lack of understanding of the kind of suffering which probably does not involve that kind of bloodshed and that kind of heartbreak. Well, with that being said, very proud to propose. Thank you.
Go. Panel, don't let all three sides in this debate run away with the idea that art is there to create a happy place full of like rainbows and sunshine that allows you to escape from reality. Because what we tell you right in the very first second of Pratyaksha's speech is that this construction comes from a long history of art and standards of art and aesthetics being dominated by a white privileged view of like what art can be, and in a sense gatekeeping what art can't be, right? For example, which is why we think like things like happy art or what they depict are necessarily not universal, but things only privileged people talk like feel and say, right? We think the struggles that Bollywood shows about you not being able to get a girl because you don't have cool clothes, or you being like thrown away from the family because you're adopted, is the extent to which suffering goes in these depictions, right? We think that there is much more that needs to be expressed in terms of lived experiences, and to make art more relatable, more egalitarian, and more accessible to the larger populace. Don't let them run away with the idea that a small group of people can depict whatever they want to see on our screens, on our sheets, and on like wherever we consume art, and like that is what it is, right? We think, which is why the striking silence on the kind of analysis that comes from Pratyaksha's speech becomes important, because CO doesn't necessarily respond to the kind of context we give you to this glorification, right? This doesn't come out of like the blue. We don't think that like it's not, we reasonably think that people don't like enjoy suffering because they derive sadistic pleasure from it. We think the reason people are able to resonate with suffering, the reason it's relatable, even if it's a shitty heartbreak song, the reason people can relate to it is because they've gone through those things. And we think even if they haven't necessarily gone through it to the extent and the viscerality to which these are depicted, there is a certain sense of relatability and and there's a certain sense of empathy that comes only from our side. And we think that the expression of this kind of suffering, a suffering that is faced by a larger group of people, especially minorities who have long been like suppressed and like told not to voice their concerns, we think that is much, their voices are more valuable than anything all these sides bring about, right? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell you why we take this debate over both benches, and then tell you why on the op bench where the team that should take the first, right? In terms of what do we get from the governments, right? There are three main ideas that they talk about. One is the idea of, misrepresentation that comes with art. OJ tells you, listen, art is subjective, and consumers will be able to interpret it the way they want. We think when we ask the POI about art being a one-way street, we tell you that that's not the case. We think there is a certain kind of value that comes from the expression of art and the expression of the kind of suffering that minorities have gone through, and things that have gotten legitimacy from this glorification, from this opening up to art for like minority artists to put things out and put things out to the mainstream, which is the important like extension that comes in this respect, right? It's not about like art glorifying suffering existing. We think what's important is that it seeped into the mainstream to a point which Parasite can get awards, to the point at which films like Gangs of Wasipur, which talks about like gangs in living in like poverty and kind of like committing crime from poverty in a small state of Bihar, becomes important. At that point, we think that when side government tells you about subjectivity, we think that these are this subjectivity is necessarily things that we see around us in the world. They had to come and tell you why this kind of suffering is necessarily problematic, right? The second thing they come and tell you, listen, there's a commodification of trauma, and that's an issue. We think that we live in a capitalist society where commodification is inescapable. Given that that is the case, what is the best way that we can get to express this trauma and kind of get this into the public eye? We think that only comes about the moment you're able to provide a platform for such art to come about. We think that only happens the moment you're able to glorify this kind of suffering in a world where people don't want to consume this in the first place. We think this is a bottom-up change in the way you consume art, and we don't think consumers can bring about this change. The only way you can do that is when arts that portray the suffering and are fed from the suffering necessarily come from bottom up and gain viewership. And we see this resonance. I think both gov sides necessarily agree with the fact that people are able to relate to this art. And we think the more relatability this is able to generate is because of the fact that it echoes these stories, but also because it's able to kind of like trounce this white minority standard of what art is and bring about like newer depictions and bring about it, which is why we think this will lead to more authentic portrayals of art. Things like for every 13 reasons why, there is a Euphoria, there is a Moonlight that actually talks about issues and grounds them in people's lived experiences. But we tell you, even in the worst case, that these lived experiences are going to be painted as coming from privileged people. 13 reasons why, we think that's still better. It is still better to address mental health issues and talk about it rather than like not do it and pretend everything is happy-go-lucky, right? Which is where we directly hit closing government's case, right? We don't think that even we don't think misrepresented suffering is going to get the kind of traction it does. But even if it doesn't, we think the creators of these kind of art necessarily have to learn about these things, necessarily have to learn about mental health, necessarily about to care about it and give somewhat of a accurate like portrayal of this. But secondly, even if this is like terrible, it isn't as authentic as it's supposed to be. We think that this is able to bring it to the conversation and bring it to light, which doesn't happen on their side. Finally, why do we think by this we completely win this over op bench? Finally, sorry, gov bench, why do we take it over op bench, right? They tell you, listen, their analysis stops at the point where they say, listen, art now becomes relatable. The fact that you're seeing people represent you, you're represented on your own terms, and we think that's okay. But what they fail to tell you necessarily is why this representation becomes increasingly important and why this is linked to the glorification. We tell you that this representation comes about with glorification and this increased platforming. Second, they tell you, listen, privileged people will now care about this kind of art and will now relate to and be more palatable to this kind of art. They don't necessarily mechanize through the debate, right? We tell you why this is going to happen. We tell you why, this changing landscape of art means that this changes the very standards that art is associated with, and this also means that now privileged artists have to be able to kind of link them and like make them relatable and engage with some amount of suffering that happens in real life to reflect these in their art they put out. For these reasons, we think we win this debate.